Chapter 3. His exertions during the pestilence. Application to Rome for spiritual assistance. When Charles had returned home and entered his own apartments, the remembrance of what he had seen seemed to weigh heavily upon him. Leaning back against the wall for support, and looking at those who had accompanied him, "Have you fully realized," he said, "the depth of wretchedness of these poor people, not plague-stricken alone, but forsaken of men, and what is far more deplorable, destitute of spiritual succor, not a single priest being found to take compassion upon them? It is I who am the cause in not having been the first to set the example of aiding them. Still, if God does not send them help in other ways, I know my duty." In these words he plainly showed his intention of serving the sick and administering the sacraments with his own hands. He had already begun to distribute alms, but his charity took a still wider range. Not satisfied with sending to the hospital a supply of provisions and necessaries, he dispatched thither a quantity of his furniture, including even his bed. He sent, too, all the silver plate he possessed to the mint, to be coined into money for their relief. While to provide for the ever-increasing calls upon his charity, he directed collections to be made both in his own diocese and sent into other parts to beg alms. To supply their spiritual necessities, as he saw that the clergy of the town shrunk from the dangers of the plague, he procured a priest and lay assistants from the Swiss valleys, men whom custom had rendered indifferent to infection, and assigned the hospital of St. Gregory to their care. Still, this was far from being sufficient for the daily increasing numbers of those who were struck down. In this strait he turned to the regular clergy, hoping to find them more ready for the work of charity, as being more detached from the world and leading a life of greater perfection. Nor was he disappointed. He found many willing to devote themselves to the work, with the consent of their superiors. He urged also upon those living in the world the blessedness of giving help, and many of both sexes were led to risk their lives for their brethren. For their use he wrote a little book, encouraging them to perseverance, and reminding them of the eternal rewards promised by God for their charity. All the while his own visits and labors were unwearied. In the course of them he found it necessary to have with him only those who were most trustworthy, as they had to converse and sometimes remain a considerable time among infected persons. He gave orders to the rest of his household, as well as all others, to keep at a distance, as the contagion was spreading more widely every day, owing to the neglect of these ordinary precautions. He found that his whole household united to put difficulties in the way. Some, out of care for their own health, quitted his service altogether. Others, to prevent him from exposing himself to danger, were chary of lending a hand to the work. Seeing the trail of the serpent in this, he called all the disaffected to him in private, and succeeded in infusing into them his own spirit of sacrifice, so that they offered themselves cheerfully to the work. He made special rules also for the rest of his household, appointing certain prayers and penances to turn aside the anger of God, with stringent precautions against infection. For himself, he acted as if he were actually an infected person, allowing no one to come near him or wait upon him, and having a rod carried before him when he went abroad, in order to keep off everyone from himself and his assistants, who were 8 in number. In the same way that all might have access to him without risk, he threw open his hall of audience with a barrier of grille of lattice-work around it. He also took the same precautions in the choir of the cathedral, for the security of the canons and the clergy during the celebration of the divine offices, which he never missed attending at this time. It was remarkable that during the whole time the plague lasted, neither he nor any who accompanied him had so much as a headache, though they were continually in attendance on the plague-stricken and those in their last agony. It was considered as a miraculous evidence of the blessing of God upon their labors. 3 persons of the cardinal's household were carried away by the pestilence, and they were not of his companions, but caught it owing to want of care and neglect of the rules he had laid down. The ravages of the disease still continuing, as the clergy of the town still shrunk from contact with it, Charles sent to ask the sovereign pontiff if he could not oblige them to administer the sacraments to the dying. He asked Bernardo Carniglia, through whom the petition was sent, to procure the opinions of certain learned persons in Rome also, and to obtain for him the following faculties from His Holiness: to dispense regular priests, who were willing to give themselves up to this work, from the obligation of obtaining the permission of their superiors; to appropriate to the service of the poor certain legacies and endowments intended for other pious uses; the faculty of absolving in cases reserved to the Holy Apostolic See; various indulgences for the service of the sick; plenary indulgences for the dying; the papal blessing for rosaries and medals; and several particular indulgences for the exercises of devotion, with special reference to the prevailing calamity, when so many were daily called to their last account. He asked also for the privileges of St. Gregory's altar in Rome, for St. Gregory's chapel in the hospital, that the souls of the faithful departed might be released from purgatory by the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Lastly, begging for these indulgences both for himself and his successor, in case he should die during the pestilence, he besought His Holiness graciously to remember in his prayers the miseries of his flock, that God would be pleased to take away the plague, the just punishment of their sins, and that he would write as a father to his people, exhorting the sick to patience in their sufferings, and all cheerfully to help and profit by this visitation sent by God to further their eternal salvation. As the ravages of the pestilence were not confined to Milan, but threatened other parts, he prayed His Holiness to call upon the bishops of those places, as good shepherds, not to forsake their flocks, but to offer their lives for the people. Gregory XIII, while loath to see the life of a prelate whom he so highly valued exposed to risk, praised his charity and self-devotion, and granted all his requests, promising him his prayers and support in all his undertakings, begging him to have some regard for himself, and not to run into unnecessary danger, reminding him that the welfare of his people depended in a great measure upon his life, and that his death would be a loss not only to his diocese, but to the whole Church. Soon after the dispatch of this letter, Bernardo Carniglia was called to his reward, and the saint's inquiry as to his power of obliging his clergy to attend to the plague-stricken remain unanswered. The Holy See graciously granted all the above requests and sent a pastoral letter addressed to the whole province of Milan, calling upon all to fulfill the duty of Christian charity at this time of trial, and urging the sick to patience and trust in God. The cardinal printed this letter of the sovereign pontiff, together with an epistle of St. Dionysius of Alexandria, in which is described the charity of the Christians of his time towards each other under a similar calamity. Also 2 sermons of St. Cyprian, one in time of pestilence, and another on almsgiving. A discourse of St. Gregory Nazianzen, on the love we owe to the sick and to the poor. 2 homilies of St. Gregory of Nyssa, on the care of the poor, and a letter of St. Augustine to Honoratus, on the duty of not deserting our neighbor in distress. All these he had translated into the vernacular, as also the Pope's letter, adding at the end an account of the devotion of St. Bernardine of Siena to the victims of the plague. His next care was to call together all the secular clergy of the city, exhorting them earnestly to a self-sacrificing love of their neighbor, and not to set too high a value upon their own lives in these times of danger. He acknowledged that he desired nothing of them which he was not ready himself to do, and promised that he would himself administer the last sacraments to them, if any should fall victims to their intrepidity. He gave it at his own opinion, and that of many learned doctors, that they were bound to administer the sacraments of penance and Holy Eucharist at whatever risk. His words did not fail in their effect. His hearers one and all, offered themselves joyfully to follow in his footsteps, and were filled with so fervent a spirit that they not only confessed and communicated, but also gave extreme unction to the dying during the plague. Yet after this it seemed that fear of the contagion and the terrible appearance of the dying robbed many of their self-possession when the time came for approaching the bed of death. Once more the saint sent for those who had so failed, one by one, and urged their duty upon them with so much force, and, where needful, with so wholesome a severity, that they were not known to be again wanting. A noble action which occurred at this time is worthy of record. The dead bodies, carried out from the hospital of St. Gregory during the night, were thrown into a public burying ground adjoining called the Fappone, in order to be ready for interment the following morning. On one occasion a poor wretch, not quite dead, had been cast out with the rest amidst a heap of putrefying bodies. Early in the morning, the priest of St. Gregory's was passing that way to take the Holy Viaticum to some dying persons. At the sound of the bell, the poor creature raised himself upon his knees amidst the heaps of corpses, and turning towards the priest exclaimed, "O my father, for the love of God, suffer me to receive the Holy Sacrament once more." The priest did not hesitate for a moment, but hastened to give the poor man the consolation he so ardently desired. After receiving his Saviour, he laid himself down again, and a few minutes later he was called away with every reason to hope for a favorable judgment from him with whom he had united himself on earth. This action, edifying in the dying man for his longing for the bread of angels, and in the priest for his charity amid so many plague-stricken corpses, was told from mouth to mouth and thought worthy of record by St. Charles himself in his little book called A Remembrance for His Beloved People. Having moved the clergy to do their duty, the cardinal for his own part made every provision for preserving them from fatal consequences as far as it was possible, laying down precautions to be used also by lay attendants on the sick, in which the office of each and every one was prescribed with minuteness and forethought. They are to be found in the constitutions of the 5th Provincial Council of Milan, and are valuable for future emergencies. While the saint was energetically attending to all these matters, the notables and chief men seemed to be thinking only of making good their retreat to their estates in the country, so that all those who were most needed to carry on the government were found to be absent. The evils produced by this state of things were increased by the governor of the city being among the number. Having ascertained the names of those who had not yet taken their departure, he sent for them and succeeded in banishing their fears and inducing them to remain and help in alleviating the general distress. In order to carry on the administration of the city, having obtained the promise of assistance, he parceled out the city into districts, assigning one to each person who undertook to visit and provide for the necessitous cases in these parts. That everything might be done in order, he recommended meetings at regular intervals for consultation on the best way of relieving distress, and that one of the clergy should be present to give the benefit of his experience and advice in spiritual matters. This arrangement was found successful, and the improved condition of the poor greatly comforted the saint. New troubles, however, awaited him. There arose a dispute between the municipal authorities and the officers of the crown as to which of them was bound to provide funds for carrying out these recommendations. In the meantime, all these good works were brought to a standstill, and the poor plunged again into suffering. St. Charles witnessed their affliction with heartfelt compassion, having already exhausted his own means and done his utmost in begging alms. There was nothing left he could do but pray fervently that God, of his infinite mercy, would vouchsafe to send succor to his people in their need, that they might not perish. At this time the governor, who had taken refuge from the pestilence at Vigevano, was obliged to return to Milan on business with the Senate. The cardinal seized the opportunity to expostulate with him in a spirit of paternal authority on his forsaking his post at such a time, and warned him of the chastisements he might expect from the hand of God, if by his example he continued to encourage the nobility in their abandonment of the city and neglect of the poor and needy. Monsignor Antonio Seneca, one of the deputies to whom the cardinal had given the charge of the city, was the bearer of this letter to the governor, who very promptly turned his attention to the needs of the people, and in conjunction with the Senate, made such provision for them as amply to satisfy the anxiety of the saint on their behalf.